Hello, my name is Valerie, and I'm going to be discussing what caused the Great Depression. Many factors played a detrimental role in what would lead to what is known as the Great Depression. One of the major influential elements that hurt the economy was the crash of the stock market. It all began in 1928. Herbert Hoover's election boosted the hopes of investors in what had come to be called the Great Bull Market. In 1924, the prices of the stock shares invested in the U.S. companies had steadily risen. By 1919, there was 317 million shares of stock, and by 1929, the numbers were more than a billion. Basically, much of the nation's capital was sucked into the stock market. What made it worse was Treasury Andrew Mellon's tax reductions that had given people more money to spend or invest. But of course, majority of the people invested their money in the stock market. Despite the soaring stock market, there were signs that the economy was weakening as steel production, residential construction, and automobile production was slowing down, as well as the rate of the consumer spending. The stock market value started to wobble and of course frightened the investors. The worst day in the stock market in history was on Tuesday, October 29th, known as Black Tuesday. That day could have been avoided how? Well, the roaring economy fell victim to overproduction and underconsumption. For instance, in the 20s, manufacturing production increased 43%. However, the economy was producing more and more that consumers could not afford to buy, and too many people had been borrowing too much money for unproductive purposes, such as speculating in the stock market. What made it worse was that business owners were gaining a lot of profit from their business, but were not increasing employee wages. So that is how a growing imbalance between production and consumption, supply and demand occurred. The impact of the declining values of the stock market created many issues, including famine and decline in employment.
Roosevelt was faced with three main challenges: reviving the economy, relieving the human misery, and rescuing farmers and their families. Roosevelt's New Deal would take a form of a series of trial and error actions trying to figure out the best way to upbring America's state of emergency. Roosevelt and his advisors initially settled on a three-stage strategy to help the crisis, which were to remedy the banking crisis and provide short-term emergency relief to the jobless, promote industrial recovery through increased federal spending and cooperative agreements between management and organized labor, attempt to raise depressed commodity prices by paying farmers to reduce the size of crops and herds. Reducing would raise the prices for grain and meat. The result wasn't perfect, but raised hope and energy. Roosevelt passed many acts in the first couple of days in office to help the bank crisis, including the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which permitted banks to reopen and provided managers for those that remained in trouble. This would prompt citizens to put their money back in the banks, and the banking crisis had ended. The first large-scale experiment with federal work relief was the Civil Works Administration, also known as the CWA, created in November 1933. The CWA provided federal jobs and wages to those unable to find work that winter. The CWA would later dissolve due to worries of people being dependent upon federal jobs. In 1935, Congress would pass a $4.8 billion Emergency Relief Appropriation Act providing work relief for the jobless. To manage these programs, Roosevelt created the Work Progress Administration, also known as the WPA, before it died out during World War II. Farm income had plummeted from $6 billion in 1929 to $2 billion in 1932. The Agriculture Adjustment Act of 1933 created a new federal agency, the Agriculture Adjustment Administration, also known as the AAA, which sought to control farm production by compensating farmers for voluntary cutbacks in production. The goal was to raise farm prices by reducing supply. The AAA saw better results in 1934 when the Secretary of Agriculture reported declines in wheat, cotton, and corn production and simultaneous increase in commodity prices. Although the New Deal programs helped the devastation in America, it didn't restore prosperity or end the widespread human suffering. As late as 1939, almost 9.5 million workers remained unemployed. As a result, it led people to do many things including theft, prostitution, and begging. Married couples couldn't afford to get a divorce and lived separately, and often husbands would leave their wives. Children weren't being supported, and an estimated 1 in 5 children were not getting enough to eat.
My name is Tyshawn Borns, and I will be talking about the continuing hardships. Although the programs making up the first New Deal helped ease the devastation caused by the Depression, they did not restore prosperity or end the widespread suffering. As late as 1939, some 9.5 million workers, which was about 17% of the labor force, remained unemployed. Critics stressed that the economy, while stabilized, remained mired in the Depression. However progressive Franklin Delano Roosevelt was on social issues, he showed little interest in the plight of African Americans, even as black voters were shifting from the Republicans to the Democrats. Roosevelt, like Woodrow Wilson before him, failed to address long-standing patterns of racism and segregation in the South for fear of angering conservative Southern Democrats in Congress. As a result, many New Deal programs discriminated against blacks, as Mary White Ovington, the treasurer of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, stressed the racism in any agency varies according to the white people chosen to administer it, but always there is discrimination. The FHA, for example, refused to guarantee mortgages on houses purchased by blacks in white neighborhoods, and both the CCC and the TVA practiced racial prejudice throughout the 1930s. But a major setback occurred in the Supreme Court ruling on Grovery v. Townsend in 1935, which upheld the Texas Democrats' whites-only election primary. Thanks to relentless pressure from Eleanor Roosevelt, the president did appoint more African Americans to government positions than ever before. One of the most visible was Mary McLeod Bethune-Cookman College in Florida, and served as head of the NAACP in the 1920s. In 1935, Roosevelt approved her appointment as the director of the Division of Negro Affairs within the National Youth Administration, an agency that provided jobs to unemployed young Americans. Bethune worked with other blacks in New Deal agencies to form an informal black cabinet to ensure that African Americans had equal access to federal programs.
The Second New Deal. The legislation that Roosevelt and Congress passed between 1935 and 1938 was strikingly different from the First New Deal in certain ways. Perhaps most important, the Second New Deal legislation relied more heavily on the Keynesian style of deficit spending than the First Deal did. Roosevelt altered his policy making in part because of complaints from critics, and in part because by 1935 it was clear that more Americans still needed federal relief assistance. Roosevelt thus aimed approximately half of the Second New Deal programs and policies at long-term reform. Predictably, Roosevelt's New Deal came under fire from the Republicans, conservatives, bankers, and the Wall Street financiers, who claimed that it doled out too many federal handouts. Many of these critics also feared that the policies and programs involved were a dangerous step towards socialism and the deconstruction of America's capitalist system. Such misgivings were understandable given the political atmosphere by the 1930s, as communism was becoming a bigger threat. In fact, Soviet agents in the United States went so far as to launch a Popular Front campaign to actively support the president. Moreover, an unpredictable number of people joined the American Communist Party during the decade. Perhaps more surprisingly, the New Deal also became under attack from the far left. Many socialist activists denounced the New Deal because they believed it was too far conservative and did not provide enough relief nor assistance. Over the years, many historians have tended to agree with this argument. Several have argued that the Great Depression would have not been so devastating for so long had Roosevelt handed out more federal money out to the greater number of Americans. The first major legislation that Roosevelt and Congress passed in the Second New Deal in response to critics was the Works Process Administration, or WPA. Created in 1935, the WPA was an effort to appease the lobbyists who clamored for more direct assistance from the federal government. The WPA was similar to the Public Works Administration of the first New Deal, this time hiring nearly 10 million Americans to construct new public buildings, roads, and bridges. Congress dumped over $10 million into this project in under a decade. Congress also passed the Social Security Act in 1935, creating a federal retired pension system for many workers funded by a double tax on every working American paycheck. The act also created an unemployment insurance plan to provide temporary assistance to those who were out of work, while also making funds available for the blind and physically disabled. Furthermore, Congress agreed to match federal dollars for every state dollar allocated to workers' compensation funds. Despite its vocal critics, the Social Security Act had an enormous impact on Great Depression-era Americans and the future generations. It brought the most sweeping changes of the Second New Deal legislation, as it not only gave income to some of the most deprived in society, but it also forever changed the way Americans thought about work and retirement. The paycheck tax were advertised as a personal retirement saving plan, even though those tax dollars were actually being redistributed as soon as they were collected. Nevertheless, retirement came to be seen as something every worker could enjoy. Still, many criticized the Social Security system for not extending pensions to enough people, particularly unskilled black people and women laborers.